Right. We are recording. Fantastic. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Social Housing Roundtable. And my name's Elaine. I am the Head of Partnerships here. And I work with Matt really to make sure that we continue to bring you the roundtable every Tuesday. As always, we like to keep it free and keep the conversation going. And we can only do that with our sponsors. So we want to say thank you to Alertical and CMSG for being our annual sponsor. And today, we also thank Giles from Energy Park who sponsored this session. Alongside Matt's recruitment business, this just helps us keep it free for all to attend and it keeps us going and the conversation going every Tuesday. So like I said, today I'm joined by Giles, he's the CEO of Energy Park. I'm going to talk with all things EV. So do, as always, get involved within the conversation. You can pop your hand up at any time. I'll also attempt to multitask. Not always great at that by monitoring the chat. But I know that, Giles, you have got slides to share today. So as you go through them, if you've got any comments, queries, questions, do pop things in the chat for us. I'll pick them up and kind of go through. Or you can raise your hand, like as always. So, Giles, do you want to try and let's see if we can get the tech working so you can share your screen.
Yeah.
I have made you a co-host.
Fantastic.
You should be able to do that.
Let me go.
Well, just letting a couple more people in. How are you getting on?
Getting there.
Good. Brilliant. We can see your screen now.
Fantastic. Good. Bear with me.
Okay.
Is that now clear and can everyone see it okay?
It's just showing your presentation view, but we can see it okay. So we've just got your slides. We haven't got the full screen. But I think it works still. We will be able to see any notes you've added.
If you click swap displays at the top, Giles. There you go.
Does that work now?
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you. Right, over to you.
Well, look, thank you very much for your patience. Joys of technology and doing these things virtually, you have to sort of you have to jump around in terms of learning new things. So anyway, just Elaine, thank you very much for setting up the meeting. Just by way of introduction, my name is Giles Desforges. I'm the CEO of Energy Park. And what we want to talk to you about today is EV charging in social housing, and very specifically, actually, sort of EV charging in apartment buildings, and why we don't believe that housing associations want to do it themselves. So I'm going to jump into it, and the first thing I'm going to talk about is Norway. Now, I guess the question people are going to ask is why Norway? Well, Norway is the leading marketplace when it comes to EV adoption. So if you were to look at sort of the amount of new car registrations which are EVs, in Norway, it's 97%. Now, why is that? Well, that's because really the Norwegians are focused on solving a problem, which is accessibility to infrastructure. If you talk to people who are EV curious, what they say is we want to make sure that we've got access to charging, and that's a critical piece. And the Norwegians have gone above and beyond in doing that. In fact, actually, they changed the law in 2021 to mean that a resident can not be refused EV charging if they request it. And that's had a significant impact in terms of uptake of people who are now driving EVs going forward. Now, if we were to jump to the UK, actually what we're seeing in the UK is pretty good. So most recently, we had 29% of new car registrations in September were EVs. So we can really see that sort of that curve coming up. And actually, when you talk to residents, they're really interested in actually getting EV charging now, because what we've seen is surveys out there which are sort of showing that one in three residents of housing associations want EV charging. Our own market research has also shown that the biggest thing that people want is access to charging. Now you layer on top of that clean air zones, fleet electrification, and changes to mobility. And actually what you're seeing is EV needs are growing. And then if you look at housing associations themselves, obviously they've got demands in terms of sustainability and scope 1 targets. And that's really driving urgency in terms of addressing the problem. Now, what we know is when you provide access, that drives adoption. So it's critical that we solve this going forward. So then the question is why haven't housing associations done it themselves? Well, we know it's difficult, right? I mean, there's so many competing priorities. And when it comes down to it, the housing association's core mission really is very much around housing, providing housing, and community first, and not really infrastructure. And there's so many competing demands. We get it in terms of sort of safety and energy and regulation. If you look at the things that housing associations have to do, there's a long list of requirements in terms of getting there. Now, we know that many housing associations have been exploring this for many years. And look, it's complex, right? It's complex, it's technical, it's legal. It's time consuming to look at this. And with so many competing priorities, we get how EV charging infrastructure tends to fall down the list of competing priorities. And the truth of the matter is it's complex, right? So it may look simple when you see a socket on the wall, but actually there's so many things, particularly when it comes to apartment buildings, that you have to consider. Safety and compliance, thinking about the electrical compliance, fire, accessibility. How do you design a solution which means that it's usable for all? And then you've got to wrap that together in terms of an end-to-end solution. Think about resident experience. It's got to be 24/7. It's got to be affordable. It's got to be easy to use. And you layer upon layer those risks and responsibilities. It's tough. And then once you've got it installed, obviously then the complexity continues to add, right? So what happens when it breaks? Who pays for that? How do you deal with complaints? The regulations can change and shift. Who's doing the maintenance? Who's doing the compliance? Then technology changes. We went to see a site recently where it was an install from about 5 to 6 years ago. That technology is no longer relevant going forward. And then, of course, if you sort of look at multiple properties, you've got multiple suppliers, you may have no data visibility at all. And actually, in terms of ensuring consistency for all your residents, it's really hard. So, when you own it yourself, it means owning every element of it. And then when you look at buildings themselves, well, different buildings come with different challenges, whether that's retrofit or new build, indoor or outdoor, there's different sort of challenges you've got to go through and work out. So if you think about retrofit, you think about the 4 million plus people who live in apartment buildings. Which ones do you prioritize? How do you ensure fairness and space and adoption? Then when you look at new build, what's the consistency there and how do you ensure that? Obviously, regulations are in place in terms of Part S to mean that new builds have to have EV charging for people who have parking spaces. But if you're buying buildings off a developer, they may have different requirements to yours. And so how do you balance that all out? And then when you look at where the car park is, obviously sort of there's different requirements. Indoors, have you thought about load balancing? Have you thought about fire safety? Outdoor, new grid connections. Have you worked that through? What happens with weather, vandalism? So the reality is one size does not fit all in terms of when you're looking at different buildings. So the good news is the government has provided significant amounts of funding for EV adoption. OZEV, which is part of DFT, is out there providing funding right now in terms of enabling landlords like housing associations to make the transition. But the reality is the scheme is complex and difficult to understand. We've been engaging with OZEV to actually look at how do we make it easier for landlords to access it? How do we make sure that when you're a large portfolio provider, you're not limited by the rules in terms of the number of claims that you can make? And the reality is, of course, is that if you've got large portfolios, that takes time to deliver. So if you think the OZEV grants are here now, but there, of course, is, as with all government money, there's no guarantee that that money will be there in the long term. And so you have to think, you either act now or you're going to end up paying more in the future. So let's get on to who we are. Energy Park is a purpose-driven organization. So we were founded about 4 years ago, specific to work on solving the equity gap in terms of EV charging, and specifically for people who live in apartment buildings. Our purpose is driving fairer and more accessible EV charging. And because of our unique funding from the Charging Infrastructure Investment Fund that the government set up, that means we can actually genuinely provide a fully funded upfront model. And of course, also, we can take a portfolio approach in terms of what we're doing. We focus on quality and compliance, but also critically in terms of thinking about actually resident experience from the charge point to payment and all the way through. Because we know that when you do that, you make it easy for people to access it. And that's critical in terms of driving adoption. Critically, actually, though, when you think about it, our solution also is very focused on making sure that non-EV drivers aren't punished for people who want to have EV charging. We make it accessible and affordable for those who are using it, but we don't charge people who haven't yet adopted EV charging. And underpinning all of that is our operational quality, making sure that when we build a solution, it's future-proof and sustainable to drive going forward. My final slide is very much, and forgive me for rattling through it, I guess it's a joy of sort of getting behind in terms of technology, is what can you do today? And I think sort of there's probably 3 buckets. And we know that various different people are on this call. So first and foremost, for residents, if you ask your provider for EV charging options, they're listening. They're already starting to think about in terms of what they do. For housing associations, it's really important that you act now, but please don't take it on yourself. And for advisors out there, think about what is a long-term sustainable solution that's future-proof, because things change, but you need to make sure that what you're putting in is there for the long term. And ultimately, look, we're here to make EV charging accessible and affordable. So please do come and speak to us if you want to get started. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing now, if that's okay.
No, that's perfect. Thanks, Giles. Really good kind of summary, I guess, about setting the scene and really what that kind of looks like in terms of, I guess, the kind of EV future. I think we've had a couple of comments in the chat. Nick reminds us that local authorities also own and manage homes. So I think when we're talking about housing associations, we're actually absolutely including kind of local authorities within that mix and councils that own those kind of properties as well. I know that Toby's jumped in there. Ted, I think you raised a really interesting point, I guess, about change and newness, telling me that electric cars are catching on fire. And I couldn't pay you to have one, and I think there is that nervousness that exists, isn't there? And ultimately, I think, Giles, you touched upon it as a non-EV user, you don't want to be penalised either. So if you haven't got that, you certainly don't want it to create any kind of safety concerns if there are kind of charging points near your home. And then Alicia kind of raises a really good point from a tenant perspective, really around, when they're being asked the question, when they're asking the question of their landlords, what exactly are they supposed to do? And I think you touched upon it, keep asking that. But is there any advice really where, you can give kind of residents? How do you kind of help people kind of squash, I guess, some of the concerns, or alleviate some of the concerns that people have a kind of a new and emerging technology, but also at the same time where there are people, perhaps like Alicia, who are keen to kind of explore the option to have an electric vehicle from a like affordability perspective, from an environmental perspective, but they're feeling as though this is a real barrier because actually they don't have permission or kind of access to kind of a charging point that feels affordable. Kind of what would you say to the kind of those two kind of counterpoints, I guess?
Yeah, well, there's probably 3 groups of people right now in terms of residents of either local authorities or housing associations. You've got those people who are already driving EVs now. Now, what they're facing into now is actually sort of that affordability gap, because if they live in an apartment building, they either have to go to a destination charging, and which is obviously sort of significantly more expensive, or they have the inconvenience and potentially safety issues of having to sort of go and use on-street charging. So, going away, parking and walking, and we're obviously we're talking to residents all the time, and EV drivers, they want accessibility now, so as close as possible. Convenience is really important to them, and obviously sort of if it's close to home, then obviously sort of it's also more affordable as well. Then there's that second group who are EV curious, who are sort of trying to understand actually sort of, what does it mean to drive an EV? Because it's different, right? In actually sort of transitioning from petrol and diesel to driving an EV, you have to get used to the fact that, it's not about going and doing a weekly trip to the petrol station. It's actually about topping up all the time. It's kind of like, if you think about it in terms of like you would with your mobile phone. Right, so your mobile phone, you don't generally let it run down until it drops out. You actually sort of charge it to keep it topped up, and that's the great thing again about having it close to home is you can just generally top up and keep your car sort of ready to go. And then there's the people who are just currently don't understand EV at all, and some of the risks that you sort of you raise. Now the reality is an EV is new technology, but it comes to sort of fire risk. Well, actually the reality is they're no more like to burst into flames than a petrol or diesel car, unless of course you're driving a Tesla and someone decides to chuck a petrol bomb at you. But the reality is that they're generally very safe, very secure, and actually sort of when it comes to having an EV, they're actually sort of easier to maintain and keep going as well. And obviously, sometimes that choice is taken away from petrol drivers. If you think about it, if the fleet car that you're driving or the van that you're driving, people are looking to electrify that, take that carbon off the road, so you have to adopt it. Or if you're living in a clean air zone, no longer sort of actually have the affordability piece in terms of being able to drive a petrol and diesel engine. So it is there. And I think if you talk to housing associations as a resident or local authorities, they want to solve this problem. They're all thinking about actually sort of how do we do this? How do we make it accessible? How do we make it affordable? And so they're all already starting down that journey. And if you let your landlord know, that's brilliant in terms of sort of continuing to sort of drive the decision making from their side.
Thanks, Charles. I think it's really interesting what you're saying about kind of where the future is going. And I think Alicia also, touched upon that within her comment around, let's be honest, this is where the kind of world is kind of heading. And if we don't have the infrastructure in place, it potentially could be quite discriminatory for those who are kind of, I guess, not able to access kind of the charge points and the benefits of kind of EV for the future. Certainly thinking about kind of where that looks like and where that goes. I think you touched upon kind of fleet there a little bit. You also talked a little bit about, I guess, the environmental drivers, but also the kind of financial benefits. If a housing association or local authority were thinking about kind of converting their fleet, because actually it feels like the right thing to do from an environmental perspective. We've all got these kind of net zero targets. What does that mean? Again, is it a big barrier not having those EV chargers for that fleet? What's the broader benefit, and what are you seeing, and what's the sector kind of telling you? Because I know you're already engaged with some landlords already. And then Brian, we'll come to you because you've got your hand up.
So look, in terms of a couple of things. One is in terms of affordability for standard utilization. If you're getting over the average, if you're driving, sort of above 2,000 miles a year, having accessibility to EV charging at home is the cheapest option. So, in terms of comparative to drive, and it's very difficult because we talk about kilowatt hours versus sort of pence per litre, but actually in terms of the mileage cost, an EV actually, if you're sort of not using the destination charging, is significantly cheaper to drive. And then obviously sort of in terms of servicing costs, because there's a lot less moving parts, there's a lot less sort of service requirements going forward. Now, obviously sort of there's the upfront cost of buying a vehicle, but the grants that the government announced this year is continuing to drive down that affordability gap. And obviously sort of the second-hand marketplace is also starting to come through for general affordability. Then if you look into sort of actually sort of what it means for fleet, fleet electrification is one of the great challenges that anyone who operates a fleet is facing into, because ultimately when it comes down to it, having access to charging is critical, because what you don't want to do is take your vans off the road for them to go and spend an hour recharging their vans. So the access to be able to charge at property when they're going to do work is really critical. So you have to start to think about that hub and spoke type model, which is, yes, have it charging at the depot, but also can you charge at the residence and can you charge at home? And think about how you sort of create that sort of that triangle in terms of pushing that through.
Thanks, Giles. Just looking at the chat before I bring you in, Brian, I think Ted's still not sold on the kind of safety angle, and I think, like we said, this is how kind of I guess new technology emerges, and we all get a little bit scared about kind of what potentially could happen. And I think that there's obviously the kind of press and media version, although like Alicia said, we see this happening, we see it more, we see popularity increasing. And I think, we do have to take sometimes a bit of a leap of faith that the right people have done the right tests on the right things. We won't get into kind of that debate. But Brian, you're very patiently waiting with your hand up. Let us know your thoughts coming in.
Case Management Solution Group, or CMSG, are the home of React, the UK's #1 case management system for ASB and community safety. We are delighted to have them as one of our key sponsors for Social Housing Roundtable 2025 into 2026. And with the ASB app now fully integrated to the platform, it allows residents to record, monitor and report issues directly to their case office in live time. What's not to love? CMSG are bringing simplicity back to case management, and I cannot recommend them enough and thank them for all of their support through this period and through the rest of the year. Thank you, CMSG, and do please go check them out on social media and on LinkedIn. Thank you.
I'm very interested in EV charging. I do have a problem in the sense that there's so many properties in this country that are on the footpath. So when somebody, like if I drive home and I park outside my property, I can't put a cable across the road to charge it up. And it's an issue for a huge amount of people. But the other part of EV charging is the grid itself. And I'm involved in a company that deals with solar panels. And one of the huge issues that we found is looped properties, where the grid itself within the local area is not capable of the demand that's being placed on it, either by generation through solar panels or by installing charge points on properties. And until that infrastructure is got in place, I've seen properties where 4 properties are looped together. And it's a huge issue when it comes to the draw on demand. And there's still properties out there with 60 and 80 amp fuses, mains fuses, which are below the levels that are needed in the first place.
I might let my colleague Toby jump in on the grid capacity point, but I think sort of in terms of the on-street charging piece, if you think about it, 45% of people in the UK don't have access to driveway. So your choices are either you charge on street or you use destination fast charging, and those are kind of your options available to you. Now, there's a lot of work going into sort of solving the on-street piece and how do you sort of run cables safely without causing any health and safety issues, but also sort of electrifying the street lamps and using those as charge points so you're not running cable across the paths. But yeah, no, look, it's a significant challenge that needs to be overcome, because there's a reality which is in 2035 you won't be able to buy new petrol and diesel cars going forward. So we've got to start working on solving the challenge for EV infrastructure across the board now. And obviously there's a lot of work going on. Toby, do you want to comment on the grid point?
Yeah, of course. So I was fortunate enough in my previous life to work with National Grid on their the beefing up of the national grid infrastructure. So there is a 15-20 year plan which we are aligned with on increasing capacity. So that's through generation, through obviously the new nuclear projects, which we were working on as well at Hinkley and Sizewell, also, other generation through wind and solar, as well as storage. There's lots of big storage projects happening at the moment. And the problem at the moment isn't necessarily that there isn't the capacity, it's transmitting that capacity to the right places and the flexibility of the grid. But the EVs actually support that, and they can be turned on and off to help to support that flexibility when it's needed. And obviously a lot of the grid capacity is used during the day. The great thing for EVs is they're typically charged overnight. So you actually take advantage of those nuclear power plants, wind farms, obviously not solar, where they are generating all the time, and often they're having to be turned off at great cost to the consumer, because it costs a lot of money to turn off a wind farm if it should be generating. So there are support things there. The thing with the capacity of certain buildings is we can balance off that, but ultimately, if it doesn't have the capacity, we can get a new grid connection. So for the car parks that are outside, we get a new grid connection. We connect into that. We check that with the DNO. We can balance against that connection to basically provide people with a good experience, the ability to charge overnight. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the use cases. So obviously we deal specifically with situations where, the way to kind of break down what we do is situations where a lot of people need to charge off a single connection, and then you need to think about communal maintenance, communal charging, communal billing. So it doesn't directly connect to someone's electricity board like it's simple in a house. You can just connect it straight to the electricity board. It just goes onto the electricity bill. In communal parking, it's a bit more difficult because running individual cables is unsafe. You get a massive volt drop. It's not efficient, etc. But then there are, as you say, there's people with their own driveway, nice and easy, lucky for them. People who have on-street parking. So whether that be, central London, where, as Giles said, there's companies like Chargy, companies like Ubitricity who do tap into the lamppost, and that's obviously the councils are using Levi funding for that. But then there's people like me. So I am on a very narrow lane in Derbyshire. My car is about 100 meters away. I cannot charge. There is no way for me to link my house box to my car. Ultimately, I have a choice there. I can just keep my diesel for another 10, 15 years. I'm lucky enough that Giles has EV charge points at our office, so I charge there. But at the times that I'm not going down to the office, I have to charge on the public infrastructure, and I have to go and find someone. Unfortunately, Tesla is actually the best cost, which really upsets me. But I can, if I go at the right times, charge for 36p a kilowatt hour, which is cheaper than running a diesel. So there are options. Unfortunately, ultimately, some of those problems just can't be solved. But in the situation where they can be solved, and going back to, I think it was Alicia's question, is how do you then make that fair? So the problem you have, and it's not necessarily the fault of the housing association or the charge point operator, there are huge costs associated with doing this. And most of them aren't able to have the investment horizon of 25 years like we can, because we're government backed. So they have to repay their upfront costs in 10 years. To do that, they have to consider how many people are actually going to adopt in those 10 years. And that's, isn't it? How many EVs are going to be sold in that time? How many people are actually going to adopt? What's the cost factors going to be involved? But ultimately, they won't get that payment back. And this is why the title of why housing associations shouldn't invest in EV infrastructure. It's just too expensive right now. In 15 years' time, when we've got good adoption, it might be good. It might be commercially viable for a housing association to do that themselves. But it's just not right now. So in that situation where it is possible to charge, that's where we come in. Luckily for someone like you, Brian, there is Turbocharge, and there's been that huge amount of investment, I think £65 million fund that was raised by the government recently to do the channel across the pavement. So when in a situation where your house is there is a pavement, and then that's where you park your car. You can have a channel installed that allows you to run your cable under, so it's not a trip hazard, it's safe, etc. And then, as we said, you can get into the lighting systems. There's a lot of them in Putney. I think Brighton, they've just put in about 2,000 charge points over the last 3 months.
Yeah, you think about that.
Making their way through. But it takes time. It does. And you have to find the demand. That thing for us is, because we take such a long view, we know the adoption is coming, so we can just go and deploy our money anywhere. Whereas for those ones, they have to be really sure that the adoption is there. They have to consider who's around. They have to consider what the exact profile of people is in those areas. And ultimately, that tends to come from people lobbying their councillors. So saying, in Brighton and Hove, there was a big thing from people lobbying their councillor. The council got hugely involved and said, we need on-street charging because we just don't have private parking here. And
But
ultimately, that's where it went.
and I think sort of the same for residents of, actually sort of if residents actually sort of go to their providers and say, look, we want this, we need this now, they're open to those conversations. But the point of Toby is it's expensive, and actually sort of finding solutions where, in effect, you're limiting the cost to both the providers but also the residents. That has to be the way forward that's sustainable for everyone.
The solution you need is one, sorry, Elaine, just to get my final point. The solution you need is one where basically anyone that wants or has an EV can charge fairly without having to pay for others to have the option and the availability. And also a scenario where people that don't have EVs aren't paying for people that have EVs to charge. And that's typically what you get is it goes into service charges, it goes into whatever kind of maintenance costs you get in there, or the people that are charged an eye-watering rate to make it available for others who aren't paying. You need a system where it's less expensive than running your current diesel or petrol, and you're not unfairly paying for someone else to have the option.
Fab. Thank you. I think you've summarised that really well in terms of kind of crystallising, I guess, where we're at, and actually picking up on the point, I think, which is around, fairness and opportunity for all really to access this kind of new tech. There's a couple of things in the chat. So Grant has said, how has Finland managed if they have a 97% EV output? I don't know if he means Norway from your start. That part of the world.
Yeah.
And then Nick has also said, he's challenging whether EVs will need to be plugged in the same way, whether it's a VHS Betamax thing, and actually we get these kind of wonderful self-charging. He's put the answer is hydrogen fuel cell self-charging, which I know nothing about. So Nick knows a little bit more about me, but I guess it's a really good point, isn't it? It's clearly working. So we've got use cases in Europe where, we can kind of accelerate, I guess, what works because they made the mistakes before we did. But on the flip side, are we at risk of investing in all of this infrastructure to plug stuff in, and we won't need to plug it in anymore?
Well, a couple of points there. I mean, I think sort of the way you get adoption is by solving the infrastructure, whether that's EV or hydrogen. Full stop, right? The investment has to be done in infrastructure. That's what drives adoption. So what Norway did well was from the very beginning, one, they made it really expensive to buy petrol cars and cheap to buy EVs. But two is they really focused on that infrastructure piece. And as I said, they changed the law to say that landlords couldn't actually refuse residents asking for an EV charge point, which makes a massive difference in terms of accessibility. Now, then you have to sort of back that up with affordability and make sure that money is available to help people put those charge points in, and they did that too. So you had both the carrot and the stick in terms of Norway, in terms of making it happen. But as I say, 97% of new vehicle registrations in Norway are EVs, and that's because it's cheap, affordable, and accessible, and that's really sort of what we have to sort of think about when it comes to managing the energy transition here in the UK. I'm not a hydrogen expert, so I'm not going to comment on that.
I guess that point though, Giles, and I guess what is frustrating sometimes within the sector is that we have to wait for a law to do the right thing. I suppose, it on paper, if this is the way we're going, this is making a lot of sense. We've got an opportunity kind of to electrify our fleet and kind of save that carbon, to the right thing for the environment. We've got an opportunity to provide option and choice for residents as to how they wish to kind of get around, those people who are requiring kind of cars, mobility vehicles, all of those sorts of things. Absolutely. Giving them an option to access perhaps more affordable, more sustainable kind of ways to travel. And then you've got, I guess, the kind of commercial the financial responsibility as well, because actually if this is the way we're going, and if Finland didn't need to make it dead cheap to do it, maybe that's, we want to make sure that it's there. You've got this kind of, it's hard to explain, isn't it? But I'm kind of thinking, why haven't we adopted this sooner if it's kind of the right thing to do? And I guess the only thing that kind of holds us back is we've got a million and one things on our plate at the moment in housing. Where does EV really fit and where does it sit? And when we've got limited resources with, I guess, still the cost of living challenges that are kind of affecting our residents, but also our colleagues and our employees. We've also got kind of the cost of kind of doing business is still increasing from a landlord perspective. How, even if you think, yep, I really want to do this, but I don't have time and we certainly don't have the cash. I guess this is where the title comes, don't invest in it.
Yeah.
I suppose what we're saying is, but do it anyway.
Yeah, look.
And how does that work?
Well, I think so fundamentally there is a genuine climate crisis, right? So I think sort of that we can see that, and we can see that sort of but there's a lot going on in terms of sort of energy efficiency of properties to improve sort of the carbon impact they're having, and obviously so Brian was talking about PV and the work that's being done there. Which is great, and actually sort of look, there's a lot of positives going on in the UK and in the housing sector as a whole in terms of decarbonisation and making that change, which is critical in terms of sort of the long-term challenges that we're facing as a planet. So that's happening, and there's some positives there, and I think sort of look, do we need regulation to really sort of to drive it through? I think there's a lot of positive examples of where people are sort of adopting change and driving change, but it's, as to your point, Elaine, it's the affordability point. It's affordability to providers and it's affordability to residents. So if you can solve both those challenges, then you're making it easier for people to do it. So you've got to work on those things. It doesn't necessarily require regulation because it should always be carrot first, but certainly sort of what we're seeing is that sort of latent demand coming through. You're seeing, as I said, new car registrations are increasingly EVs. You're seeing residents asking for it. Our own market research has shown that people who, if they're given the access to it, will adopt. And so if you can solve those pieces, it's not a sort of field of dreams piece, but I'm a big believer that sort of if you put the infrastructure in place, people will adopt it.
Yeah. And I think we ask a lot of our residents. At the moment the sector is, certainly very much focused on kind of hearing the voice of the tenant, really understanding kind of how it best serves its kind of community, not in just to increase kind of satisfaction with you basics, your core services, but also, genuinely looking at opportunities for kind of co-design and influencing the kind of strategy. That is certainly the way in which I think the kind of sector feels as though it does social good by really just checking in and saying, are we delivering this? Are we delivering our services in the way that kind of that make you happy? I wonder how many landlords, and have you got any experience of how many landlords are actually asking their residents, is the demand here? Because I think on the other side, you will have people, and we had this, and I talk about when I started in the sector 19 years ago, we were like, well, no one's really got a smartphone, so we don't need to put an app together. And actually, it was a wild assumption. And now everybody's got a smartphone, and we're talking about tenant apps and tenant engagement and digital transactions. I don't want this to be the kind of let's assume customers and residents don't need EV. Have you got examples of landlords, and you don't have to name drop if you're not allowed, but I'm assuming you're already working with landlords who are asking those questions, and how are they asking the questions?
Absolutely. So Toby, myself, and the rest of the team are talking to housing providers up and down the UK, and what they're telling us is residents are either asking about it or complaining about it. And so again, we're doing our own market research, going around talking to people who live in apartment buildings, and what they're consistently telling us is we want this and we want it now, because we're either sort of EV drivers already, or we're going to be moving across from petrol and diesel to EV, and so we need to have that access to chargeable, which is affordable and accessible. And so we're seeing it all the time. What we're seeing with housing associations is they're tracking their customer data, because they're good providers, and they're hearing what residents are saying through residents committee and their representatives, and listening directly, and they're saying we want it. And as I said, one of the large housing providers was telling us that 1 in 3 of their residents is asking for it now.
Really?
So people are talking and they're understanding it. Challenge. It's balancing all the sort of the competing priorities. We get it. It's difficult.
Yeah,
all the things are impacting on the sector, right? It's tough.
Yeah, and we have got a lot of plates spinning at the moment. I guess one of the things we are doing is kind of really making sure that we understand that asset intelligence that we have, though. Lots of landlords I talk to are refreshing their stock condition surveys, that are visiting their homes and properties. Not only because we've got decent homes too round the corner, and certainly in England we've got the MEES, minimum energy efficiency standard. I think I'm still getting my head around that acronym. But again, in Scotland, again, similar kind of environmental kind of standards that kind of they want to hit, and milestones being paused because actually we're just reviewing them right now. So, with that kind of drive and with that kind of, I guess, with all of these things, and we've got resident demand, how are you kind of supporting people to make sure that they're doing that? Because I think what you said was in scenarios where it is suited, which I think is what I'm hearing in between, is not all scenarios are well suited to this. So what would a landlord go and do, to
So,
use asset intelligence to help?
yeah,
Alert Call return as one of the keynote sponsors for the Social Housing Roundtable in 2025 into 2026, and we're delighted to have them back. Alert Call help as many people as possible feel safe, connected, and informed by combining ingenious technology and award-winning human contact. As you can see from this touchscreen I've got with me, Alert Call's digital engagement solution helps social landlords proactively know their customers and properties by putting a portable touchscreen in every home, offering a daily property check through the optional OK Each Day service, plus repairs reporting, tenant surveys, and much more. They also provide Beyond Warden Call, an easier, simpler, and lower cost wireless warden call solution with video door entry, dispersed telecare, and smoke alarms. Alert Call work with over 60 housing providers across the UK to enhance two-way engagement between customers and their landlords. In 2022, Alert Call won the Queen's Award for Enterprise and Innovation, and in 2023, Alert Call won Housing Supplier of the Year. We're delighted to have them back with us throughout the course of this year, and please do go check them out on social media and LinkedIn to find out more. Thank you very much, Alert Call, for sponsoring us again.
Yeah, so obviously, sort of, there is a piece which is large providers are now starting to assess their assets for viability for EV charging. Obviously, sort of, that can be a large exercise, but we're seeing people do it, gathering information and then using that to sort of prioritize that, align it with resident requests and resident needs, and then that gives us sort of a portfolio view. I think sort of we're in a unique position in terms of how we approach it, which is we think portfolio rather than individual site. And obviously sort of it's a long-term program to be able to do this. If you think that we've got 10 years and counting to actually sort of make sure we've got infrastructure in place, because you stop selling petrol and diesel, you've got to have the infrastructure in place. That takes long-term thinking and long-term planning, but it starts with understanding your asset base and your requirements and going from there. But what we're hearing from landlords across the UK is we need to do this. We need to do this soon because it's a big program for us to be able to deliver this for all our residents' needs.
Yeah, okay. So what I'm hearing is kind of start now, but again, it's how you get that kind of conversation to the boardroom, I guess, and move it out of the kind of nice to have bucket to the actually prepare for something rather than kind of.
But we're seeing that happening now. I mean, the conversations that we're having now, people we're talking to, it is an exec team priority right now. So there's, it is up there in terms of strategic priorities across housing providers, and certainly sort of the largest ones are sort of leading the charge on this. But obviously, sort of, if you can take again, we can take a broader view for the marketplace and actually sort of balance out that across the UK. As I said, our purpose is to make EV charging affordable and accessible, because that's what drives adoption, right? So that's why we're sort of looking to work with both large and small providers to make sure that it's possible to charge a vehicle at home.
And I guess more access makes it more affordable, isn't it? Because we know that, it's just the way the world works. Just talking about, I think, Giles, the only thing we haven't really touched upon, and I guess, we talked a little bit about financial viability, how do we create the capacity to be able to kind of invest in this? And what I think you're saying is there is funding available. Is that right?
Yeah, so there's a number of sources of funding available. So OZEV, which is the Office for Zero Emission Vehicles, if I quote it correctly. Toby's looking at me like I got it right. They've specifically geared up to make sure there's access to EV charging and making sure it's changing over. So money's available from the government to make this now, and it's based on number of charge points you're installing or the infrastructure costs you're doing. But there's two buts. One is if you're a large housing provider, you're limited in terms of the volume of claims you're allowed to make within a year. And again, we're working with OZEF on that. And second thing is actually the uptake of those grants for by landlords, whether social or private, for apartment buildings has been low. And that's because, is it because it's not happening, or because it's difficult to be able to make a claim? And again, we're working between the landlords and the government in terms of sort of making sure that those grants are more easily understood and accessible to make sure that transition is there. But our business model isn't based on that. Our business model is based on the fact that we have this unique backing from CIF, the Charging Infrastructure Investment Fund, which means that we aren't reliant on OZEF grants, and we can deploy different government money in terms of making sure it's affordable for housing providers across the UK to be able to put in place the EV infrastructure that residents need.
Brilliant. Okay, so I think, what we've talked about today is, I guess, the challenges and the barriers to kind of, EV, and I think some of it, is kind of playing out in the chat a little bit about, the skepticism of kind of the new technology, and there's always there's arguments for and against, isn't there? But I think what we always are coming back to is, are we giving fair opportunity for all? So if they are on board, what does that look like?
Yeah,
Brian,
look,
you've your hand up. And I'm just conscious of the time. We've got about 10 minutes left. Do you want to come in, Brian?
One of the things which is just striking me now is that we're actually building developments now which are not suited for EV charging, particularly in community areas. You've got some developers who will like to have 0.5 parking spaces per apartment, which starts off with, you don't have a parking space, and it's first come, first served. So in some ways, this needs to go back to the 0 point of when you're building a building, you've got to provide sufficient parking spaces for the people who are going to live there. And you see developments, and I've seen developments in places like Manchester and everything else, where trying to find the parking space is your first point, never mind being able to plug your car in. So you've got to go back. It's that infrastructure. And I think this is what is putting a lot of residents off, is the fact that they are not sure if these things can be done. And where you put in a lot of doubt, and I'm not talking about the ability of the car not to go on fire. I've had petrol cars go on fire. So yeah. I know it from that side. But where you're building the problem to start with, it's never going to, down the line, be able to be done. And then you're relying on 50% of the people who live in a building having to find a parking space somewhere else that they can charge their car. And it might be 5 miles down the road, and I'm not parking my car down the road.
No, well, I mean, look, I think that there's a couple of points there. One is new builds under Part S are required to provide EV charging points for per allocated parking bit, right? So that they have to do it. Now, then that's sort of driving a sort of a mindset, which is maybe you reduce the number of parking spaces available in a building, but how does that help people with mobility issues, for example? So yeah, you need to take a sort of an end-to-end approach to it, and people are looking. I think sort of, we can't solve everything, and very much sort of we can solve the existing housing problem. And we're working with developers to make sure that there's adequate and affordable EV charging solutions out there in new builds as well. As I said, it's a different mindset in terms of thinking about retrofit versus new build, but it's definitely there in terms of what they can do and how they can provide it. And going back to your point, how do you join it up with PV and solar, and making sure that there's a sort of a rounded solution which is environmentally friendly.
Yeah, and ultimately, So we're saying we've been speaking to Earls Court Development Company because they're part of a larger group that we're speaking to, and they only have 20 spaces because London current planning regulations for new build apartment buildings has actually tried to make it without any cars. We want to do it no cars. Unfortunately, as we all know, they haven't beefed up the public transport infrastructure to actually make that feasible. But I think part S, with how it is and how it's a huge expense and how they have to consider a much higher capacity on their buildings, and they have to ensure that they're basically deploying capital that's not going to be realized. They are trying to avoid putting spaces in, basically. Hopefully, the standard supply and demand will say, okay, well, we're actually looking for buildings with car parks now, and we'll see that come back up and it'll be better. But yeah, all the ones we're talking to at the moment that say they're building in London say, oh no, we're not putting car parking because it's just easier. Because let's buy a tube station, it's fine. You're like, yeah, okay. And they are putting in, 16, 20 spaces but they're all disabled spaces. They all just sat there empty with maybe 1 or 2 cars in there. Because they're waiting for, just in case there are people that have those needs, accessibility needs, that will take on one of those spaces.
Yeah, that's okay for a central area like London, where you do have an infrastructure there, but you get somebody who's living in the Yorkshire Dales. I'm sorry, but my nearest bus stop is 5 miles away. Never mind anything else. So again, that comes back to, you've got outside areas where you're building flats, or you're building apartments, or you're building developments, and it's making sure that infrastructure is in place.
Absolutely.
Because today's build is tomorrow's retrofit. So don't build a problem that has to be solved in 5 years' time, sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think if you look at access to EV charging through things like ZapMap, you can see that sort of that rural urban split in terms of access, it's a big challenge. It's a really big challenge.
Thank you both. I think today's problems are tomorrow's retrofit, or what you said, Brian. That's not a catchphrase we want to have, is it? And I think it's about just kind of getting things right. Just looking at the chat, we've had a couple there. I think Alicia kind of concurring a lot with I guess what you've said, and some really useful kind of information there from Toby. If you want to have a look and kind of start the conversation with your landlord. I think Andrea is saying sometimes the parking restrictions are down to planning. I work in older people's housing. There is never enough parking, and it's often first come, first served. We do put EV chargers in, but these spaces are underused in that generation, to the point where the customers have asked for them to be removed in favour of standard spaces. So I guess, I think there's all of that kind of argument. Certainly, I'm working with a landlord at the moment on a regen project, and there's a whole later living block, and it's really thinking about actually access to parking, full stop, for visitors, carers, support, as well as being able to provide infrastructure for families who do need more flexibility sometimes when they've got prams, pushchairs, shopping, you name it. So I think we do really need to think about kind of
So just to add on that, we were talking to a housing provider recently, and they have a large stock of extra care, and actually what they see there is a significant proportion greater than the norm in terms of EV adoption. So it can depend on sort of the provider and the residents as well. And so actually my own father, who's in his 80s, is an avid EV driver. Because he just feels it's far more accessible and affordable for him.
And I think it goes back to kind of the smartphone thing, doesn't it? Oh, old people aren't going to use X, Y, Z, and we can't make those kind of, and we shouldn't make those kind of assumptions. I think ultimately, as landlords and housing providers, we have a responsibility to really understand the kind of communities and the residents that we work with, and actually what future generations want as well. So I think, it's about asking questions, and I think it's about really kind of having that conversation. With a few minutes to go, I just thought I'd summarize and then let you provide any kind of final thoughts or kind of rabble rousing and call to action, Giles. So I think what I think we've heard today is demand is there and it is growing, but it's a kind of, if you know, not to quote Field of Dreams, but I will, if you build it, they will come. Those are old enough to remember that one. So I think we need to start to think that kind of next step and that future look, and what future generations of social housing tenants may want and ask for, rather than kind of scramble when you've got all of this kind of demand, or we've got a legislation that forces us to go down that route. What can you do now to act early? And by the sounds of it, there is some cash available to make that kind of those changes where suitable, kind of lift that kind of financial burden for the landlord, and actually then be able to give back kind of more affordable charging for those kind of residents in that kind of community. I think what we've also heard is around a little bit about kind of fairness and opportunity. You know, we don't want to be a sector that does things after everybody else. You know, we want to lead the way, and I think being able to provide social tenants now with the opportunity to access EV is something that we should be thinking about and asking them if they want. And residents, ask your landlords. I think, you know, don't necessarily be fobbed off. And I'm not suggesting that landlords do, but I do think that it's still, like Ted has said, you know, it's a little bit unknown, isn't it? And there's still some uncertainty and skepticism around it, even though we're seeing growing demand kind of more broadly in the country. And finally, I think what you've said today is about partnership. Don't go it alone. We're learning from Norway, we're learning from others, we're taking that information on board, but people like you guys, I guess, are kind of conduit to have that kind of initial conversation without any commitment, I suppose, because like you've said, it's not going to be suitable for everything. But at the same time, you know, if Brian wants an EV, he doesn't want to have to drag a cable, you know, down the road, nor does he want to necessarily go and kind of queue for the bus, because he's priced out of that kind of diesel petrol kind of market for the future. That is it. What I've taken away from an hour that's gone really quickly, on a topic that, you know, I think is really interesting. We should continue to talk about. Giles, any kind of final thoughts from you about how, and you know, what people have said today, and what people can take away?
Yeah, look, I mean, firstly, thank you for setting this up, and thanks for the participation, both in the chat and the questions. I think it's been really insightful. I think sort of the takeaways are, you know, the opportunity is there because the residents want it and the market is ready for it. I do take a, you know, as you say, take a partnership approach, think end to end, and really focus on sort of a solution which is sustainable, built on quality, that puts the resident very much at the heart of it. And you know, if you want to know more about what we can do, please do sort of reach out to us, and we're happy to have a dialogue with you in terms of how you can actually sort of provide EV infrastructure into social housing.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you who've contributed to the conversation as well today. We could not do it without this fantastic community that remains kind of curious and happy to discuss and disagree. That's why we love you all so much about it. I think join us next week. It's our 200th episode. I forgot to say it was our 199th episode today, but it's our 200th episode where the new CIH president, Julie, will be joining us to launch her presidential campaign. So one that you don't necessarily want to miss. Thank you so much again, and look forward to seeing you next week. Take care, everybody. Bye.